Salt-laden winds swept across the weathered deck of the Crimson Siren as Captain James Blackwood stormed from his quarters, a leather-bound journal clutched in his white-knuckled grip. His crew froze mid-task, their weathered faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The fearsome pirate captain, renowned across 7 seas for his tactical brilliance and merciless raids, stood speechless, a sight rarer than Spanish gold. The journal belonged to Elizabeth Hastings, the spirited noblewoman they'd reluctantly taken aboard 3 weeks prior. Her written words had done what no naval fleet could, rendered the infamous Captain Blackwood utterly dumbfounded. Could this headstrong woman truly desire him? More bewildering still, could she envision him as the father of her children? What madness had possessed her to record such intimate dreams where he might discover them? The Crimson Siren cut through the azure waters of the Caribbean like a predator, her blood-red sails a warning to all who beheld them. At her helm stood Captain James Blackwood, the afternoon sun, casting harsh shadows across the scar that bisected his right brow. He adjusted his worn tricorn hat and raised his brass spyglass, scanning the horizon with practiced precision. "Anything of interest, Captain?" First Mate Thomas Riley approached, his weathered face a map of old battles. Known as Cutthroat Riley not for unnecessary brutality, but for his direct manner, he'd served beside Blackwood for 12 years, longer than most pirates lived. "Nothing yet," Thomas said. Blackwood collapsed the spyglass with a snap. But the day is young. At 38, Captain Blackwood had earned his fearsome reputation through tactical brilliance rather than wanton cruelty. The stories told in port taverns that he was a vengeful ghost, a nobleman's son turned demon. The feared ghost of Gibraltar amused him. Fear kept potential enemies cautious and potential prey compliant. "How's our guest faring?" Blackwood asked, his voice deliberately casual. Riley's mouth twitched. "Miss Hastings continues to adapt. Doc Burke says she's quite knowledgeable about medicine, been helping him organize his supplies." Blackwood nodded, unsurprised. In the 3 weeks since they'd taken Elizabeth Hastings aboard, the unexpected result of a merchant ship raid that was supposed to yield Spanish gold, not an English noblewoman, she had proven remarkably resilient. The intended ransom demand to her wealthy father had been delayed by storms and naval patrols, leaving them with an unusual passenger. "And Fletcher?" Blackwood inquired after his quartermaster. "Inventory in the hold. Says we're running low on powder. We'll need to make port soon." Oliver Quickhands Fletcher, at 32, was the youngest of Blackwood's senior crew, earning his position through an uncanny talent for knowing precisely what supplies remained without consulting ledgers. A burst of laughter drew Blackwood's attention to the main deck, where Dr. Solomon Burke sat with Elizabeth Hastings on a barrel, demonstrating how to tie a proper sailor's knot. At 60, Burke was the oldest man aboard, respected for his steady hands and vast knowledge. The unlikely friendship between the elderly doctor and the noblewoman had developed quickly. Elizabeth's honey-brown hair was bound in a practical braid, her once fine dress modified for ship life. Though initially terrified, she'd shown neither the hysterics nor the haughty disdain expected of women of her station. Instead, she observed, adapted, and slowly earned grudging respect from the hardened men around her. Blackwood found himself watching her more often than was prudent. Her quick mind and occasional sharp retorts intrigued him. She'd clearly received an education beyond the typical ornamental learning afforded to women of wealth. "The men are growing restless," Riley noted, following his captain's gaze. 3 weeks without action. "Some wonder if having a woman aboard truly is bad luck." Blackwood scoffed. "Superstitious nonsense. We've avoided engagement due to the naval patrols, nothing more." He tapped his fingers on the worn wood of the helm. "But you're right, we need a prize soon. Morale suffers in idleness." Below, Elizabeth laughed at something Burke said, the sound carrying across the deck. Blackwood found himself studying the curve of her neck, the determined set of her shoulders. Not once had she begged or wept for rescue. Instead, she'd asked questions about navigation and tides that revealed unexpected knowledge. "She's a curious one," Riley observed carefully. "Not what we expected." "No," Blackwood agreed. "She is." That evening, as sunset painted the western horizon in amber and crimson, Blackwood retreated to his quarters. Maps lay scattered across his desk, alongside ship manifests and tide charts. The planned raid on a Spanish merchant vessel would restore the crew's spirits and replenish their dwindling supplies. As he reached for his navigational tools, his hand brushed against a small leather-bound book, partially hidden beneath a chart. He didn't recall placing it there. Opening it revealed elegant handwriting, distinctly feminine. Elizabeth Hastings' private journal had somehow found its way into his quarters. Proper conduct dictated he should close it immediately. Instead, his eyes caught a sentence that bore his name, and propriety was forgotten. Elizabeth Hastings stood at the ship's rail, breathing in the salt air as dawn painted the eastern sky. 3 weeks aboard a pirate vessel had taught her to treasure these quiet moments. She absently touched the silver locket nestled against her collarbone, the only possession she'd managed to keep when fate delivered her into the hands of the Crimson Siren's crew. Opening the locket revealed miniature portraits of her parents. Her father, William Hastings, wealthy merchant and owner of Hastings Trading Company, appeared stern even in this tiny likeness. Her mother, gone 7 years now, retained the gentle smile that had been her shield against society's expectations. "Your mother had the same look when pondering something important." Dr. Burke's voice startled her from her contemplation. Elizabeth smiled at the elderly physician. "You're perceptive, Doctor. Noticing details keeps a ship's doctor employed," he replied, joining her at the rail. "Most passengers we've had were too busy sobbing or threatening to notice a sunrise." "I've done my share of both," Elizabeth admitted, but neither proved effective. At 28, Elizabeth had long ago accepted her peculiar position in London society. Too educated for most suitors' comfort, too outspoken for proper drawing rooms, and too curious about matters deemed unsuitable for ladies. Her father had despaired of finding her a husband until Lord Pembroke, 47, widowed and in need of her father's connections, had offered for her hand. The engagement had been announced, the wedding planned, and Elizabeth's future sealed, until the storm that had separated her ship from its naval escort and delivered her into the path of pirates. "Did you always want to be a physician?" she asked Burke, genuinely curious about the educated man who had chosen this unconventional life. "I studied at Edinburgh," he replied. "Practiced respectably for years until a patient died, the governor's son. It wasn't my fault, but someone needed to hang." He shrugged. "Captain Blackwood needed a doctor. Fate has strange currents." "Indeed it does," Elizabeth murmured. Her initial terror, upon capture, had given way to practicality. She'd survived by making herself useful, first by tending minor wounds alongside Burke, then by surprising the navigator with her knowledge of stars and charts. Her father had never approved of her interest in navigation, but the captain of her father's flagship had been more indulgent, teaching her in secret during voyages she'd been permitted to join. "The captain watches you," Burke noted casually. Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He watches everyone. It's his ship." "Differently," Burke insisted, with curiosity. Before she could respond, the ship's bell rang, signaling the change of watch. The peaceful morning dissolved into activity as sailors moved with practiced efficiency. Captain Blackwood emerged from his quarters, and Elizabeth found herself studying him. Despite herself, there was an elegance to his movements that belied his fearsome reputation. His dark hair was tied back simply, his clothing practical rather than flamboyant like some pirates she'd read about. The scar through his right eyebrow gave his face character rather than menace, and when he issued orders, men jumped to obey not from fear, but respect. "Miss Hastings," he acknowledged her with a slight nod as he passed. "Captain," she replied with equal formality. These brief exchanges constituted the majority of their interaction. He kept his distance, seemingly uncertain how to address a woman who was neither crew nor typical captive. For her part, Elizabeth found herself increasingly curious about the man behind the reputation. That evening in her small cabin, formerly a storage room cleared for her use, Elizabeth wrote in her journal by lantern light. The leather-bound book had been a gift from Burke, who'd noticed her restlessness and suggested recording her thoughts might help pass the time. In its pages, she documented her observations of ship life, sketched the interesting characters comprising the crew, and increasingly found herself writing about the enigmatic captain. His leadership style, the respect he commanded, the rare smile that transformed his face when a young cabin boy successfully completed a difficult task. Lately, her entries had taken a more personal turn. She wrote of wondering about his past, imagining conversations they might have under different circumstances, and occasionally allowing herself to pen private fantasies that would mortify her if discovered. Elizabeth tucked the journal beneath her thin mattress, unaware life aboard the Crimson Siren settled into an unexpected rhythm. Elizabeth found herself rising with the dawn watch, taking meals with the crew, and spending afternoons assisting Dr. Burke or studying navigation with Fletcher, who'd grudgingly accepted her interest as genuine. The ship's logbook became her favorite reading, its pages chronicling voyages, battles, and the daily minutiae of pirate life in the captain's precise handwriting. "Your penmanship suggests formal education," Elizabeth remarked one afternoon, finding Blackwood alone at the navigation table. He glanced up, surprised by her directness. "As does yours, Miss Hastings. Not typical for a merchant's daughter. My father believed in education, though he likely regrets encouraging my curiosity now." She ran her fingers along the weathered edge of a chart. "It led me to ask inconvenient questions about my arranged marriage." Something flickered in Blackwood's eyes. "Understanding, perhaps. Knowledge is rarely convenient for those who prefer obedience." Their conversations, though brief, had evolved from terse acknowledgments to these moments of unexpected connection. Elizabeth noted each one carefully in her journal, analyzing them like specimens under a naturalist's glass. "Storm approaching, Captain." The lookout's call interrupted them. "Southwest, moving fast." Blackwood was immediately in motion, barking orders as dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Elizabeth stepped back, watching the crew transform into a single organism under his command. "Miss Hastings, secure yourself in your quarters," he instructed, but without condescension. "This looks significant." By evening, the storm had engulfed them. The Crimson Siren pitched violently, waves crashing over her gunwales. Elizabeth, ignoring Blackwood's directive, helped Burke tend to a sailor with a gashed forehead, holding him steady against the ship's wild movements. When the cabin door burst open, she expected Blackwood's anger at her disobedience. Instead, his expression registered only momentary surprise before acceptance. "Doctor, another injury on deck," he reported, rain dripping from his coat. His eyes met Elizabeth. "Your assistant seems well employed here." The storm raged through the night. Elizabeth moved between tasks, securing loose items, passing messages, even helping Riley navigate when Fletcher was needed elsewhere. By dawn, exhaustion had replaced fear, but satisfaction warmed her more than the blanket someone had draped across her shoulders. "You performed admirably." Blackwood's voice reached her as she leaned against the rail, watching the storm recede. Few experienced sailors show such composure during their first Caribbean tempest. "I'm learning that fear is best channeled into action," she replied, too tired for pretense. He studied her with that intensity she'd come to recognize, as if reassessing previous conclusions. Indeed, a lesson many never master. In the storm's aftermath, subtle changes rippled through the ship's social fabric. The crew's sideways glances carried less suspicion, more acceptance. Burke openly called her his assistant. Fletcher asked her opinion on a navigational puzzle. Even Riley's perpetual scowl softened marginally in her presence. Most notably, Captain Blackwood began seeking her out for brief conversations. He inquired about her knowledge of shipping routes, seeming genuinely interested in her father's trading strategies. She in turn asked about his tactics against larger vessels, admiring his innovative approaches without romanticizing their purpose. These interactions found their way into her journal in increasingly detailed entries. No longer mere observations, they evolved into reflections on the man himself, his intelligence, his unexpected moments of dry humor, the respect he showed even the lowest cabin boy. One night, alone in her cabin, she allowed herself to venture beyond reality, into speculation. What might a different meeting have yielded? What lay beneath his carefully maintained reserve? She wrote of fictional conversations, shared confidences, and eventually, hesitantly, of more intimate possibilities. A touch, perhaps, or the imagined warmth of standing beside him at the helm under stars. Such fancies were harmless, she reasoned, merely a diversion during captivity. No one would ever read these private thoughts. 3 days after the storm, dark clouds gathered again. Blackwood, concerned about the ship's damaged rigging, searched for the navigation charts he'd loaned to Elizabeth. Not finding them in the expected locations, he reluctantly approached her cabin, knocking brusquely. Receiving no answer, he entered cautiously. The charts lay on her small desk, but as he reached for them, his hand disturbed several items, sending her journal slipping to the floor. It fell open, pages fluttering. He bent to retrieve it, intending only to replace it, when his own name caught his eye. Blackwood knew he should close the journal immediately. A gentleman would. But then he'd abandoned claims to gentlemanly conduct years ago, hadn't he? His eyes fixed on the page before him, his own name written in Elizabeth's elegant script. Captain Blackwood inspected the repairs today, he read. He stood so close I could detect the scent of sea salt and sandalwood. Our hands nearly touched as we both reached for the same rope. I wonder if he noticed my breath catching, or how I lingered a moment longer than necessary. Heat rose in his face. This was inappropriate. He moved to close the journal when another passage caught his eye. I dreamt of him again last night, not as the fearsome pirate captain, but as James, the man behind the legend. In my dream we stood together on the quarterdeck of a ship that was ours alone. His hands, so capable and strong, rested gently on my waist. When he spoke my name, it sounded like a prayer. Blackwood swallowed hard. This was beyond inappropriate. It was intimate, private. He should stop reading immediately. Instead, he turned the page. What madness possesses me to write these things? And yet, the fantasy comforts me. I imagine a life where circumstances were different, where we might have met as equals at a harbor master's office or a cartographer's shop, where I might have shown him my maps, and he might have shared his adventures, where perhaps we might have built something together, a partnership, a home, a family. The next lines made him physically step back. I can scarcely admit, even to these pages, how far my imagination has carried me. Last night I dreamt of children, our children, a boy with his father's commanding presence and strategic mind, twin girls with my stubborn determination and his kind eyes, for they are kind, whatever tales are told of him. In my dream, I watched him teaching our son to navigate by stars, while the girls demanded stories of adventure. I awoke with tears on my cheeks, mourning a happiness I've never known and never shall. Blackwood closed the journal with trembling hands. He'd invaded her most private thoughts, and what he'd found had shaken him more thoroughly than any naval broadside. She desired him. Not the captain, not the pirate, but the man. She imagined children with him, a family. The notion was so foreign, so unexpected, he could scarcely process it. He replaced the journal where he'd found it, and grabbed the charts, retreating to his quarters with uncharacteristic haste. There he poured a generous measure of rum and drank it in one swallow. Women had desired him before, certainly, for his power, his wealth, the thrill of danger he represented. But this was different. Elizabeth's writings revealed not just physical attraction, but a vision of a shared life, of mundane moments and meaningful connections. It was nonsense, of course. Foolish feminine fantasy. She knew nothing of him. Not truly. Not the blood on his hands, the vengeful rage that had driven him to piracy, the demons that still haunted his sleep. And yet, she had seen something in him, something he'd thought long buried. The man he might have been, in another life. The rum burned in his throat. He poured another measure, staring at the amber liquid without drinking. The ship's bell rang, marking the change of watch. Life continued around him while his thoughts remained trapped in Elizabeth's written words. By morning he'd convinced himself to disregard what he'd read. Captivity played tricks on the mind. Her writings were merely the desperate fantasies of a woman in an uncertain situation, attaching meaning to meaningless interactions. This resolution lasted until he emerged on deck and saw her. She stood with Burke, helping inventory medical supplies, the morning sun illuminating her profile. She laughed at something the doctor said, the sound carrying across the deck. When she turned and saw him watching, her smile faltered, but didn't disappear. She nodded in acknowledgement. That simple gesture unleashed the flood of words he'd read. He could almost hear her voice speaking them. His throat tightened. "Captain?" Riley appeared at his side. "The men await your orders." Blackwood cleared his throat. "Yes. Prepare to change course. We'll make for Nassau before continuing south." As Riley relayed his instructions, Blackwood found himself watching Elizabeth again. She worked efficiently, her movements graceful despite the ship's gentle rocking. She belonged here in a way he couldn't explain. In his pocket he'd placed a folded page, torn from her journal in a moment of inexplicable impulse. The page that spoke of children. Elizabeth returned to her cabin that afternoon to find something amiss. Her belongings appeared untouched, yet an inexplicable sense of intrusion lingered in the air. She glanced at her small desk where she'd left her journal that morning. It wasn't there. A thorough search of the cabin yielded nothing. Panic rose in her throat as she contemplated the implications. The journal contained her most private thoughts, fantasies she'd never voice aloud. If someone had taken it, if someone had read it, the ship's bell interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She forced herself to breathe deeply. Perhaps she'd misplaced it. Perhaps she'd moved it herself and forgotten. She'd search again later with a calmer mind. On deck, the crew worked with focused precision, preparing for their course change. Elizabeth assisted as needed, all while scanning faces for any sign of smirking knowledge or whispered gossip. She found none, though Captain Blackwood seemed unusually absorbed in his duties, barely acknowledging her presence. By evening, her journal remained missing, and her anxiety had evolved into grim resignation. Someone had it. Someone knew her secrets. She could only hope it was Burke, who might return it discreetly without comment. As she sat with the doctor during the evening meal, she carefully asked, "Have you seen my journal by chance? I seem to have misplaced it." Burke shook his head. "Not since I gave it to you. Check with Fletcher. He's forever collecting stray items for his inventory." Before she could pursue this suggestion, the cabin door burst open. Captain Blackwood stood framed in the doorway, her leather-bound journal in his hand, his expression unreadable. The mess hall fell silent. Elizabeth felt blood drain from her face as dozens of eyes shifted between them. "Miss Hastings," Blackwood's voice cut through the silence. "A word in private, if you please." She rose on unsteady legs, aware of the crew's curious stares as she followed him to his quarters. Inside, he closed the door and placed the journal on his desk. "You had my journal," she said, her voice remarkably steady, despite her racing heart. "I did." He remained standing, maintaining distance between them. "I found it while retrieving my charts." "And you read it?" Not a question. Yes. No attempt at denial. Mortification warred with anger. Her hands trembled, and she clasped them tightly. "That was private, Captain. Not meant for anyone's eyes but mine. I realize that. And yet you took it upon yourself to violate that privacy." Her voice rose slightly. "Tell me, did you enjoy the entertainment? Did my foolish fancies provide amusement? A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I assure you, Miss Hastings, amusement was not my reaction." "No? Then what was?" "Disgust. Pity." She grabbed a delicate porcelain teacup from his desk, a remnant of some past plunder, and slammed it down, satisfaction flaring as it shattered. "How dare you judge me for thoughts I never intended to share?" "I'm not judging you," he replied, his controlled tone a contrast to her emotional outburst. "I'm merely confused." "Confused?" She laughed bitterly. What could possibly confuse the great Captain Blackwood? That a woman might see beyond your fearsome reputation, that someone might imagine you capable of tenderness. He stepped closer, his eyes intensely focused on hers. "That you, of all people, would write such things about me." The unexpected vulnerability in his voice halted her tirade. "What does that mean, me of all people? You're educated, cultured. The daughter of a wealthy merchant. I'm a pirate with a price on my head in 3 countries. You should despise me." "Perhaps I should," she acknowledged. "But I've observed you, Captain. You run a disciplined ship. You treat your men fairly. You've shown me courtesy when you might have—" She swallowed hard. "Your actions speak more truly than your reputation." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or reluctant appreciation. The tension between them transformed into something more dangerous, more electric. He took another step toward her. "The things you wrote," he began, "were private fantasies," she finished, heat rising to her cheeks. "Nothing more. About children," he said quietly. "Our children." She closed her eyes briefly, wishing the deck would open and swallow her whole. A dream, a foolish dream. Before he could respond, shouts erupted from the deck. The lookout's voice carried clearly, "Sail ho, British colours, 2 ships, bearing down fast." Their moment shattered. Blackwood was instantly the captain again, all personal matters forgotten as he strode toward the door. "We'll continue this discussion later," he said, then paused. "Your journal is yours again. I apologize for the intrusion." As he disappeared, addressed the new threat. Elizabeth stood alone in his quarters, her journal and their unfinished conversation abandoned in the face of more immediate danger. The Crimson Siren transformed into a hive of coordinated activity. Men raced to battle stations, cannons were readied, and weapons distributed with practiced efficiency. Elizabeth emerged from the captain's quarters to find Fletcher directing her below deck. "Captain's orders," he explained tersely. "All non-combatants secured." She opened her mouth to protest, but stopped when she saw Blackwood at the helm, spyglass trained on the approaching vessels. His posture had changed, a predator now, not the conflicted man from moments ago. This was the ghost of Gibraltar, the strategist who'd outmaneuvered naval squadrons and merchant convoys alike. "Their patrol vessels, not heavily armed," Blackwood called out, collapsing his spyglass. "But there are 2 of them, and they've spotted us. No outrunning them with our damaged rigging." Elizabeth hesitated at the hatch. Something didn't align with Fletcher's directive. If these were British patrol ships, they might be her salvation, her return to civilization, to her father, to the life she'd left behind. Yet she felt no surge of relief, no joy at potential rescue. "Miss Hastings," Burke appeared beside her, medical bag in hand. "I could use your assistance below. There may be injuries." She recognized the tactic but followed anyway, grateful for the purpose it provided. In the makeshift infirmary, Burke prepared bandages and instruments with calm efficiency. "Will we fight?" she asked. "The captain rarely chooses direct confrontation when outnumbered," Burke replied. "He'll have something planned." Above them they heard Blackwood's commands, followed by the controlled chaos of a ship preparing for combat. The usual sounds of a working vessel gave way to an eerie silence broken only by essential communications. Suddenly the ship heeled sharp. Elizabeth braced herself against a bulkhead as the Crimson Siren executed a tight turn. Cannon fire erupted, not from their ship, but from one of the pursuers. The sound of splashing indicated a miss. They're firing warning shots. Burke explained. They want to board, not sink us. For nearly an hour they remained below, the battle unfolding through sounds and vibrations. The Crimson Siren's own cannons finally spoke, followed by splintering wood and distant shouts. Elizabeth prepared bandages methodically, her thoughts drifting to the captain. What strategy had he devised? Was he in danger? Why did that possibility disturb her so deeply? The ship rocked violently, not from cannon fire but from a deliberate maneuver. Men shouted, feet pounded on decks, and the clash of steel on steel announced boarding actions. The infirmary door burst open, and two crewmen carried in a wounded comrade with a gash across his shoulder. British boarded from the starboard side, one explained as they laid the man on the table. Captains drawn them into a trap. More wounded arrived, both pirates and naval officers. Elizabeth worked alongside Burke without hesitation, treating friend and foe with equal care. Her hands remained steady even as her mind raced. Each new arrival brought snippets of the battle above. Blackwood had somehow split the British forces, isolating one vessel while engaging the other. "He's taken their captain," a blooded pirate reported proudly. "Surrendered with his tail between his legs." He did. Relief flooded Elizabeth, followed immediately by confusion at the intensity of her reaction. When the hatch finally opened to reveal Blackwood himself, Elizabeth's breath caught. Blood streaked his face from a cut above his eye, and his coat was torn at the shoulder, but he stood tall, victorious. His gaze swept the infirmary, landing on her with an intensity that made her flush. "We've captured the lead vessel," he announced. "The second has struck its colors." He approached, watching as she finished bandaging a young naval officer's arm. "You've been busy." "As have you," she replied, noting the fresh wound on his brow. "You should let me clean that." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at her concern. He nodded once and sat on a nearby barrel while she gathered clean water and cloth. As she tended his wound, awareness crackled between them like static before a storm. His proximity affected her more than she cared to admit, especially after their interrupted confrontation. "Why didn't you stay in the captain's quarters?" he asked quietly. "You might have been safe with your countrymen." The question caught her off guard. She paused, cloth poised above his brow. "I don't know. I think you do," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Before she could respond, Riley appeared at the door, holding a white flag of surrender taken from the British vessel. "Captain, their officers await your terms." Blackwood rose, his hand briefly covering hers where it rested on his shoulder. "We'll continue our discussion later, Miss Hastings." The unresolved By nightfall, the Crimson Siren had relieved the British vessels of useful supplies, weaponry and a modest amount of coin. The officers and wounded were returned to the smaller patrol ship with enough provisions to reach the nearest port, while the larger vessel was scuttled after being stripped. Such mercy wasn't typical pirate practice, Elizabeth noted, but seemed characteristic of Blackwood's pragmatic approach. "Why not keep both ships?" she asked Fletcher, as they inventoried the newly acquired supplies. "Can't crew them properly," he explained, "and the captain doesn't believe in needless deaths. Leaving them adrift without water would be murder, just the same as cutting their throats." A commotion on deck interrupted them. Riley burst into the hold, his expression grim. "Naval squadron spotted southeast," he reported. "At least 4 ships of the line. Word must have spread about Miss Hastings' capture." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. A full squadron meant her father had leveraged his influence, perhaps offering a substantial reward for her return. It also meant serious danger for the Crimson Siren and her crew. "Captain wants you," Riley told her directly. "Bring the charts of the Lesser Antilles." In Blackwood's quarters, she found him bent over maps with a look of intense concentration. He glanced up when she entered, his expression softening momentarily before returning to business. "Your father appears to have mobilized half the British Navy," he remarked dryly. "He's very persistent," she replied, spreading the charts he'd requested. "And very wealthy. both troublesome qualities in an adversary. Blackwood traced routes with his finger. Standard escape routes will be watched. We need an alternative. Elizabeth studied the map, her mind racing. Her father would have provided detailed information about likely pirate havens, making traditional hiding spots dangerous. Her eyes caught on a small, unmarked inlet on an otherwise unremarkable island. Here, she said, pointing to the spot. Local fishermen call it Phantom Cove. The entrance is obscured by rock formations, visible only at certain angles. Most charts don't mark it. Blackwood raised an eyebrow. And you know this how? I've sailed these waters with my father since childhood. I've collected stories, local knowledge. She met his gaze steadily. I've always been fascinated by places others overlook. A hint of admiration flickered across his face. You continue to surprise me, Miss Hastings. The ship changed course immediately, using the cover of darkness to slip away from the pursuing squadron. Elizabeth remained in the captain's quarters, assisting with navigation as they charted their approach to the hidden cove. Their shared purpose created a truce of sorts, the tension of their unfinished personal discussion temporarily set aside. Near dawn, the Crimson Siren navigated through a treacherous passage barely wider than the ship itself. Sheer rock walls rose on either side, opening suddenly into a sheltered lagoon invisible from the sea. Lush vegetation descended almost to the waterline, providing natural camouflage. Impressive, Blackwood murmured as they dropped anchor. We could hide here for weeks if necessary. The squadron will search the established havens first, Elizabeth said. If we're fortunate, they'll assume we've made for the Spanish territories and focus their efforts westward. Blackwood studied her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see through her carefully maintained composure. You're helping us evade your potential rescuers. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. I am. Why? The directness of his query matched the intensity of his eyes. Elizabeth considered deflection but found herself unwilling to hide behind pretense. Because I'm not certain I wish to be rescued. The admission hung between them, weighted with implications neither was prepared to address fully. Blackwood cleared his throat, breaking the moment. The men will need rest after the battle, and night navigation will remain here at least until we're certain the squadron has moved on. He hesitated, then added, Thank you, Elizabeth. Your knowledge may have saved my crew. Her given name on his lips sent an unexpected warmth through her. It was the first time he'd used it. You're welcome, James. She matched his informality deliberately, testing the boundaries of their shifting relationship. His eyes widened slightly at the sound of his name, so rarely used aboard ship. For a moment they weren't captain and captive, pirate and merchant's daughter, just a man and woman standing close in the soft dawn light, the ship creaking gently beneath them. The spell broke when Riley knocked, reporting that the ship was secured and watches posted. Blackwood resumed his captain's demeanor, issuing orders for repairs and rest rotations. As Elizabeth turned to leave, he spoke once more. We still have a conversation to finish, when time permits. She nodded, uncertain whether to anticipate or dread the continuation of their interrupted discussion about her journal and the private thoughts he'd discovered within it. Phantom Cove proved to be the sanctuary they needed. 3 days passed, with no sign of pursuit, allowing the crew to repair damaged rigging and tend to wounded comrades. The natural bounty of the island supplemented their supplies: fresh water from a small waterfall, fruit from the jungle's edge, and fish from the lagoon's clear water. Elizabeth found herself enjoying this unexpected respite. The beauty of their hiding place offered a welcome change from the confined quarters of the ship. During daylight hours she assisted with repairs or gathered medicinal plants with Burke. In quieter moments she sketched the cove in the margins of her reclaimed journal, careful now to keep her more personal thoughts unwritten. On the third evening, Blackwood declared a night of rest and celebration. The threat of immediate capture had passed. Repairs were nearly complete, and the men deserved recognition for their victory against the patrol ships. Barrels of rum were rolled onto the beach, a fire pit dug, and fish prepared for roast. As twilight painted the sky in purples and golds, Elizabeth sat on a fallen log near the fire, watching the crew's transformation from disciplined sailors to boisterous revelers. Burke settled beside her, offering a bottle of amber liquid. "The captain's private reserve," he explained, "a sight better than the crew's rum." She accepted it with raised eyebrows. "Did he authorize this generosity?" "He suggested it." Burke nodded toward Blackwood, who stood apart from the main gathering, deep in conversation with Riley. As if sensing their attention, he glanced their way, his expression softening almost imperceptibly when his eyes met Elizabeth. "He looks at you differently," Burke observed, following her gaze. "Does he?" she replied non-committally, though her pulse quickened. "You know he does." The doctor's tone was gentle, but knowing. "And you look at him differently too." Elizabeth took a careful sip from the bottle, the fine liquor warming her throat. "It's complicated. Life usually is," Burke chuckled, "especially at sea." As the evening progressed, the crew began sharing stories and songs. Fletcher revealed a surprisingly melodious tenor, leading shanties that had even the most stoic sailors joining in. Elizabeth found herself laughing at their antics, momentarily forgetting the uncertain future that awaited them beyond the cove. "May I join you?" Blackwood's voice startled her. Burke had wandered off to tend to a sailor who'd gashed his hand, attempting to demonstrate knife-throwing. "Of course," she replied, suddenly aware of her wind-tousled hair and sun-flushed cheeks. He sat beside her, respecting the proper distance a gentleman would maintain, yet close enough that she could detect the now familiar scent of sandalwood and sea salt she'd once described in her journal. The memory brought heat to her face that had nothing to do with the fire. "Your knowledge of this cove saved us considerable trouble," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone despite the noise around them. "I'm in your debt. Consider it repayment for not throwing me overboard when I proved more trouble than expected," she replied with a small smile. A rare laugh escaped him, a warm, rich sound she'd heard only a handful of times. "Is that what you think would have been my solution? Isn't that what fearsome pirates do with troublesome captives?" "Perhaps." His expression grew thoughtful as he gazed into the fire. "But I've never considered myself a typical pirate." "No," she agreed softly. "You're not." He produced a bottle similar to the one Burke had shared with her earlier. "A toast, then, to atypical pirates and unexpected allies." They drank in companionable silence, watching sparks from the fire spiral toward the star-filled sky. The easy camaraderie felt dangerous somehow, more intimate than their previous tense encounters. "You still haven't told me why you didn't choose rescue," he said finally, his eyes remaining on the flames. "When the patrol ships attacked, you could have made your presence known." Elizabeth considered her answer carefully. "At first I was simply being practical. I knew what you were capable of. I'd seen how you run your ship, how you strategize. The naval officers would have been outmatched." And later, his gaze shifted to her face, intent and searching. Later, she hesitated, the rum making her bolder than wisdom advised. "Later I realized I wasn't ready for this adventure to end." Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to something warmer, more dangerous. He leaned closer, the firelight casting dramatic shadows across his features. Their shoulders nearly touched, the space between them charged with unspoken possibilities. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice lower than before. The moment shattered as a drunken sailor stumbled nearby, nearly falling into the fire before being caught by his companions. By the time order was restored, the intimate atmosphere had dissipated. Blackwood stood, offering Elizabeth a hand up with formal courtesy. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation another time," he suggested, though reluctance colored his tone. "Perhaps we should," she agreed. The Crimson Siren departed Phantom Cove at dawn, slipping through the narrow passage with the first light. Reports from a friendly vessel had confirmed the naval squadron had moved westward, creating an opportunity for Blackwood to resume his original course. Elizabeth stood at the rail, watching the secret cove disappear behind them, feeling oddly wistful about leaving their temporary sanctuary. "We've received intelligence of a merchant convoy 2 days' sail southeast," Riley announced during the officers' briefing in Blackwood's quarters. Elizabeth had been invited to attend, her knowledge of shipping routes now valued rather than merely tolerated. "Origins?" Blackwood inquired, studying the marked charts. "Mixed flag, primarily Dutch and Spanish, 6 vessels with moderate escort." Riley placed a manifest on the table. "Cargo is varied, spices, textiles, some silver." Elizabeth glanced at the document, then froze. Among the listed vessels was the Surser's Pride, one of her father's ships. She must have made some small sound of recognition, because Blackwood's eyes immediately flicked to her face. "You know this vessel," he stated rather than asked. "The Mercer's Pride belongs to my father's company," she confirmed, keeping her voice neutral despite her conflicted emotions. "I've sailed on her several times." Silence fell as the implications settled over the gathering. Attacking her father's ship would cross a line, transforming her from accidental captive to accomplice in their eyes. "The Mercer's Pride is known for its superior speed," she continued, professional knowledge overriding personal concerns. "Captain Wells is cautious but capable. He'll position himself in the center of any convoy, protected by escorts." Blackwood studied her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to search for motives behind her words. "Interesting that you'd provide tactical information against your father's interests." "I'm merely stating facts," she replied evenly. "What you do with them is your decision." The meeting concluded with no firm commitment to target the convoy. As the others filtered out, Blackwood asked Elizabeth to remain. When they were alone, he leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "That was your opportunity to plead for your father's ship," he observed. "Yet you didn't." Elizabeth turned to the window, watching the endless blue horizon. "Would such a plea have swayed your decision?" "It might have." She glanced back, surprised by his admission. "Why?" He hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Because your good opinion has become unexpectedly important." The simple statement carried weight beyond its brevity. Before she could formulate a response, he continued, "We'll avoid the Mercer's Pride if possible. I have no desire to make an enemy of your father, beyond what I've already done by hosting his daughter these past weeks." "Hosting," she repeated with a small wry smile. "Is that what you call it now?" The corner of his mouth lifted. Semantics seem important when one is attempting to be civilized. "Is that what you're attempting to be, James?" "Civilized?" His name again, a deliberate intimacy she was growing bolder in employing. The subtle shift in his posture told her he noticed and was affected. "With you?" "Yes." His voice lowered, though it grows more challenging by the day. The charge between them intensified, that now familiar electricity that seemed to crackle in the air whenever they were alone. Before either could act on it, a shout from the lookout shattered the moment. "Sail ho! Merchant vessel, northwest bearing." The captain was instantly in motion, all personal matters set aside as he strode to the deck. Elizabeth followed, squinting in the direction the lookout indicated. A single ship approached, flying Dutch colors, likely separated from its convoy. Blackwood issued crisp orders, and the Crimson Siren adjusted course to intercept. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for potential engagement. Elizabeth watched Blackwood transform once again into the tactical commander, all traces of the personal man hidden behind the captain's persona. The merchant vessel, recognizing the approaching threat, attempted to flee but stood little chance against the faster pirate ship. Within hours they had drawn alongside, and boarding parties prepared to cross. "Stay with Burke," Blackwood instructed Elizabeth before joining the boarding party. She nodded, understanding that witnessing a raid firsthand would force her to confront realities she'd managed to avoid during her time aboard. The merchant ship surrendered with minimal resistance, a wise decision that prevented bloodshed. Elizabeth assisted Burke in treating minor injuries as the pirates transferred cargo to the Crimson Siren. When Blackwood returned, he carried a leather portfolio which he handed directly to her. "The ship's manifest," he explained. "I thought you might find it interesting." She opened it, scanning the contents. Halfway down the document, a familiar name caught her eye: Hastings Trading Company. Several crates of fine textiles consigned by her father's business were listed among the cargo. Elizabeth looked up, meeting Blackwood's steady gaze. "Did you know?" "Not until we boarded," he replied. "It seems fate has a peculiar sense of humor." The merchant ship was released with enough supplies to reach the nearest port, Blackwood's now familiar Mercy. As they resumed course, Elizabeth contemplated the manifest in her hands, a tangible reminder of the world she'd left behind, and the complicated position she now occupied. Not quite captive, not quite crew, caught between loyalty to her father and her growing connection to the enigmatic captain. In the week following the merchant ship encounter, Elizabeth found herself increasingly integrated into the Crimson Siren's operations. Her knowledge of shipping routes and merchant practices proved valuable, earning her respect beyond what her medical assistance with Burke had garnered. Still, the discovery of her father's goods aboard the Dutch vessel had left her introspective, questioning where her loyalties truly lay. She stood at the bow one morning, sextant in hand, calculating their position with practiced precision. The navigator, an older sailor named Hargrove, watched with grudging approval. "You've a natural talent, Miss Hastings," he admitted. "Most men take years to develop such accuracy." "My father believed practical skills would serve me better than needlepoint," she replied, recording her calculations in the ship's log. "Though I suspect he intended those skills for managing household ledgers, not navigating a pirate vessel." Hargrove chuckled. "Life takes unexpected turns. Been at sea 40 years and still get surprised." The sound of approaching footsteps ended their conversation. Captain Blackwood appeared, nodding to Hargrove before turning his attention to Elizabeth. "How does she handle today?" he asked, referring to the ship's response to the prevailing winds. "Well enough," she replied, "though she lists slightly to starboard since the repairs. I've adjusted our heading to compensate." Something like pride flickered in his eyes. "You've become quite the navigator. I had foundation knowledge. Your crew has simply helped me refine it." She hesitated, then added, "Though proper tools would improve accuracy." That afternoon, Blackwood summoned Elizabeth to his quarters. When she arrived, he presented her with a polished wooden box. Inside, nestled in velvet, lay a complete set of navigation instruments: compass, dividers, parallel rulers, and a brass sextant of superior quality. "These belonged to a Spanish captain who no longer had need of them," he explained, watching her reaction carefully. Elizabeth ran her fingers over the finely crafted tools. "They're beautiful and quite valuable. They should be used by someone who appreciates their purpose." He hesitated, then added more softly, "Someone with the skill to employ them properly." Their hands brushed as she lifted the sextant, the brief contact sending unexpected warmth through her fingers. The moment lingered, neither withdrawing immediately. "Thank you, James," she said quietly, using his given name deliberately, despite Hargrove's presence by the door. The navigator's eyebrows rose slightly at the familiarity, but he made no comment as he accepted the charts. Blackwood handed him and departed with a knowing glance between captain and woman. "The men have started to consider you one of us," Blackwood observed once they were alone. "No longer a captive, but a valued addition." "And you?" Elizabeth asked, boldness overriding caution. "How do you consider me?" The directness of her question seemed to catch him off guard. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "I consider you," he began, then stopped, reassessing his words. "You've become essential to this ship in ways I hadn't anticipated." "To the ship," she repeated carefully. "Or to its captain?" His gaze intensified. Is there a distinction? I believe there is. The tension between them had grown palpable, a living thing demanding acknowledgement. Before either could act on it, a knock at the door announced Riley's arrival with news. Ships approaching from the north, the first mate reported. British flags, one appears to be the Intrepid. Blackwood's expression darkened. Commodore Pembroke's vessel. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. Lord Pembroke, my former fiancé, commands a naval vessel? Both men turned to her in surprise. You were engaged to Commodore Pembroke? Riley asked, incredulous. My father arranged it, she replied, her voice tight. Lord Pembroke's naval connections benefit trade. I broke the engagement shortly before boarding the ship that you intercepted. Understanding dawned in Blackwood's eyes. You weren't traveling to meet your father. You were fleeing an unwanted marriage. A marriage to a man 30 years my senior, with a reputation for cruelty to his first wife, she confirmed. My father was displeased with my decision. Blackwood absorbed this information with a calculating look. Pembroke has hunted the Crimson Siren with unusual dedication for years. This explains his involvement in the search for you. It's not merely duty or recovery of property, Elizabeth realized aloud. It's wounded pride, which makes him dangerous, Blackwood concluded. Riley, prepare to outrun them. We can't match the Intrepid's firepower. As Riley hurried to relay orders, Blackwood turned back to Elizabeth. You might have mentioned this connection earlier. I thought him merely a lord with trade investments, she replied. I had no idea he commanded a naval vessel. Blackwood studied her face. You truly feared this marriage. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Enough to risk everything to escape it. Something shifted in his expression, understanding perhaps, or newfound respect. He touched her arm briefly. No one on this ship will return you to him. You have my word. The simple promise carried weight far beyond its practical implications, sealing something unspoken. The Crimson Siren outran the Intrepid, exploiting her superior speed and Blackwood's intimate knowledge of the archipelago's treacherous passages. For 3 days they navigated increasingly remote waters, eventually reaching a sheltered island chain rarely frequented by naval vessels. Only then did Blackwood allow the crew to relax their vigilance. Elizabeth had remained mostly in her cabin during their fight, aware that her presence on deck might distract from the urgent tasks at hand. When she finally emerged, she found the ship anchored in a quiet bay, lush green hills rising beyond a white sand beach. Pembroke won't find us here, Burke assured her as they stood at the rail. Few know of this place except local fishermen who have no love for the crown. How does the captain know it, she asked. Burke hesitated. That's his story to tell if he chooses. As if summoned by their conversation, Blackwood approached. He looked exhausted but satisfied, the lines around his eyes deepened by 3 days of minimal sleep. Miss Hastings, he greeted her formally, mindful of the crew nearby. I trust you've weathered our hasty departure without difficulty. I have, she replied, though I regret being the cause of additional danger to your ship. Pembroke needed no additional motivation to hunt us, he said dismissively. Your connection merely explains his unusual persistence. Burke excused himself with a knowing glance between them. When he'd gone, Blackwood's posture relaxed slightly. Would you join me this evening? He asked, his tone softer. There are matters we should discuss privately. The invitation sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. Of course, that evening, Elizabeth presented herself at the captain's quarters, having taken unusual care with her appearance, despite limited resources. She'd mended the tears in her dress, washed her hair with rainwater, and borrowed a small amount of lavender oil from Burke's medical supplies. Blackwood opened the door himself rather than calling her in, another small intimacy that didn't escape her notice. The cabin was transformed from its usual utilitarian arrangement. Charts and weapons had been cleared from the central table, replaced by a simple but elegant meal. Candles provided warm light, and a bottle of wine stood open. "I thought you might appreciate something beyond ship's rations," he explained, seeming almost uncertain, a stark contrast to his usual confident demeanor. "It's lovely," she assured him, genuinely touched by the effort. As they ate, conversation flowed more easily than she'd anticipated. He spoke of recent voyages, carefully editing details that might compromise her conscience. She shared stories of her unconventional upbringing, her mother's influence on her education, and her father's grudging indulgence of her interests. "And Pembroke?" he asked eventually. "How did that arrangement come about?" Elizabeth sighed. "My father's business suffered setbacks last year. Lord Pembroke offered financial partnership with conditions." She met Blackwood's gaze directly. "I was one of those conditions." His expression darkened. "Your father agreed to this. He saw it as a reasonable alliance. Pembroke is wealthy, titled, influential." She traced the rim of her wineglass. "When I refused, my father insisted I sail to Jamaica to reconsider while visiting my aunt. I never intended to reach Jamaica." "You planned to disappear," he realized. "I had funds sewn into my clothing, contacts in Barbados." She smiled wryly. "Then your ship intervened, rendering my plans unnecessary." "Fate has a curious way of providing alternatives," he observed. After dinner, he surprised her by revealing a small door she'd never noticed, hidden behind a tapestry. It opened into a private alcove, containing bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. "Your library," she breathed, running her fingers along the spines. "Shakespeare, Milton, scientific treatises, historical accounts, navigational texts. An educated man's collection. How did you come by these?" "I wasn't always a pirate," he replied quietly. She turned to find him watching her with an unguarded expression. "Who were you, James Blackwood?" He hesitated, then reached for a book on classical education. "I studied at Oxford. My family expected a career in law or politics." His mouth twisted. They didn't anticipate my preference for the sea. This glimpse into his past fascinated her. "You chose this life?" "Not exactly." He replaced the book carefully. "Circumstances narrowed my options." "What circumstances?" He seemed to consider how much to reveal. "Suffice to say, Lord Pembroke and I have history beyond my piracy." Before she could press further, he changed the subject, asking about her favorite authors. They discovered shared appreciation for Shakespeare's comedies and Milton's imagery, leading to animated discussion of passages they admired. Later, as she prepared to return to her cabin, he stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Your journal," he said unexpectedly. "I've been meaning to address it properly." Heat rushed to her face. "That's unnecessary." "It is necessary," he insisted. "I invaded your privacy. Read thoughts never intended for my eyes." He met her gaze directly. "I've thought often of what I read, perhaps more than I should." The admission hung between them, charged with implication. Elizabeth found herself unable to look away from the intensity in his eyes. "And what conclusions have you drawn?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped close. "That some dreams may be less impossible than they first appear." Dawn broke over the hidden bay with deceptive tranquility. Elizabeth stood at the bow, contemplating Blackwood's parting words from the previous evening. Their conversation had ended there, interrupted by Riley, with an urgent matter, requiring the captain's attention, but the implication lingered in her mind. Some dreams may be less impossible than they first appear. A shout from the crow's nest shattered her reverie. Sails, multiple vessels approaching from the east. The peaceful morning erupted into frantic activity. Blackwood emerged from his quarters, spyglass already raised. "Naval formation," he announced grimly. 4 ships of the line, including the Intrepid. Elizabeth felt her stomach drop. "How did they find us?" "A question for later," he replied, already issuing orders to prepare for battle or flight, whichever proved necessary. As the ships drew closer, it became apparent that escape was impossible. The naval vessels had approached from multiple directions, effectively boxing in the Crimson Siren. Blackwood's expression hardened as he assessed their options. "We're outgunned and outnumbered," Riley stated the obvious. "Fighting means destruction, and surrender means the gallows," Fletcher added. Blackwood's gaze found Elizabeth across the deck. Something unspoken passed between them, regret perhaps for conversations left unfinished. "Prepare for defensive action," he ordered, "but raise the white flag. Let's hear their terms before we commit to battle." As the British ships surrounded them, Elizabeth felt the weight of her position acutely. Had her presence aboard somehow led Pembroke to their location? Was she responsible for the danger now facing the crew? The Intrepid drew alongside, close enough that Lord Pembroke's figure was clearly visible on the quarterdeck. He was older than Elizabeth remembered, his posture rigid with military bearing, his face set in stern lines beneath his powdered wig. "Captain James Blackwood," his voice carried across the water. "You will surrender your vessel and crew immediately. In particular, you will release Miss Elizabeth Hastings unharmed." Blackwood stepped forward, his bearing regal despite the circumstance. "And what assurances do we have of fair treatment if we comply?" "Pirates receive the treatment they deserve," Pembroke replied coldly, "though I might be persuaded to recommend mercy for your crew if you surrender without resistance." Elizabeth moved to Blackwood's side, ignoring his subtle gesture to stay back. "Lord Pembroke," she called, "I am not being held against my will." Pembroke's expression darkened. "You've clearly been coerced, my dear. Your father is most distressed by your abduction." "My father arranged a marriage I did not consent to," she replied boldly. "My presence on this ship, while initially involuntary, is now by choice." Murmurs rippled through both crews at this declaration. Pembroke's face flushed with anger. "Enough of this farce," he snapped. "Blackwood, you will surrender now or we open fire." A tense silence fell. Elizabeth could feel the crew's eyes upon them, awaiting their captain's decision. With their position hopeless, Blackwood finally nodded. "Lower your weapons," he instructed his men. "We surrender." The boarding action was swift and ruthless. British Marines swarmed the Crimson Siren, roughly disarming the pirates and binding their hands. Elizabeth found herself separated from the crew, escorted to the Intrepid with a pretense of courtesy that did little to disguise her effective captivity. Blackwood was brought aboard last, his wrists shackled. A Marine on either side. Despite his circumstances, he maintained a dignity that impressed even the British officers. When his eyes met Elizabeth across the deck, she saw not defeat, but determination. "Captain James Blackwood," Pembroke announced formally as they stood face to face. "You stand accused of piracy, theft, destruction of crown property, and most recently, the abduction of Miss Elizabeth Hastings." "I deny the last charge," Blackwood replied evenly. "The others I leave to the evidence." Pembroke's smile held no warmth. "The evidence condemns you thoroughly." He turned to a nearby officer. "Search his belongings. I want every document, every scrap of information that might lead us to his associate." When the officer returned, he carried a flat wooden box, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. "Found this hidden in a secret compartment, sir." Pembroke opened the box and removed a folded document, yellowed with age. His expression shifted from triumph to cold fury as he read it. "So," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "James Edward Blackwood, once Lieutenant Commander in His Majesty's Navy." He held up the commission document for all to see. "Before you deserted your post and turned traitor." Gasps and murmurs erupted around them. Elizabeth stared at Blackwood in shock, pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. "You were a naval officer," she whispered. "He was more than that," Pembroke interjected before Blackwood could answer. "He was my first officer, before he betrayed his oath, his country and me." The revelation hung in the air like cannon smoke. Blackwood's eyes never left Elizabeth's face, watching as her understanding transformed to bewilderment. "Take him below," Pembroke ordered. "Prepare him for transport to Kingston." Elizabeth was given quarters aboard the Intrepid befitting her station, a small but well-appointed cabin that nonetheless felt like a prison. For 3 days she was permitted on deck, only under escort, treated simultaneously as an honored guest and suspicious conspirator. Pembroke's men had been instructed to show her every courtesy while ensuring she had no contact with the captured pirates, now imprisoned in the hold. "You look much recovered from your ordeal," Pembroke remarked during dinner in his cabin on the 3rd evening. He had insisted on her company each night, a pretense of normalcy that made her skin crawl. "I suffered no ordeal, my lord," she replied carefully. "As I've explained, while my initial capture was involuntary, my continued presence aboard the Crimson Siren was not." Pembroke's smile remained fixed. "Stockholm Syndrome is well documented among captives, my dear. Your father and I both understand you're not responsible for such confused loyalties." She bristled at his condescension but forced herself to remain calm. Antagonizing him would not help Blackwood or his crew. "Speaking of confused loyalties," she ventured, "I was unaware of Captain Blackwood's naval background. You seem to know him quite well." A shadow crossed Pembroke's face. Lieutenant Commander Blackwood was once a promising officer. His betrayal was unexpected. "What form did this betrayal take?" she asked, keeping her tone casually curious. Pembroke studied her for a moment. "He deserted during a critical engagement, taking valuable charts and intelligence with him. 23 good men died as a result." He sipped his wine. "But that's all in the official record. No need to trouble yourself with such unpleasantness." The deflection was obvious, but Elizabeth nodded as if satisfied. "When we reached Kingston, another week, weather permitting." His expression softened in what he clearly believed was an attractive manner. "Upon arrival, we can put this unfortunate chapter behind us. Your father has reconfirmed his blessing for our union." Elizabeth nearly choked on her wine. "Our engagement was dissolved before I left England, a misunderstanding, exacerbated by female hysteria." He patted her hand patronizingly. "All is forgiven. The wedding can proceed as planned once we return." She withdrew her hand, struggling to maintain composure. "And the prisoners, what awaits them in Kingston?" His eyes hardened. "Justice. Blackwood will hang within days of our arrival. The crew will likely face transportation to the colonies, though some of the officers may join their captain at the gallows." The casual declaration of Blackwood's death sentence sent ice through Elizabeth's veins. She excused herself shortly after, pleading fatigue from the sea journey. Back in her cabin, she paced the small space, mind racing. Pembroke intended to marry her regardless of her wishes and execute Blackwood regardless of any mitigating circumstances. She had perhaps a week to prevent both outcomes. That night, she began a new journal, a small leather-bound book, provided by Pembroke's steward at her request. Unlike her previous writings, these entries were carefully crafted for potential discovery. She wrote of her confusion during captivity, her relief at rescue, her gratitude toward Pembroke. Between these falsehoods, she inserted subtle observations about the ship's routines, guard rotations, and the location of keys. On the 4th day, Elizabeth noticed a young cabin boy who seemed to watch her with unusual interest. When her marine escort was momentarily distracted, the boy pressed something into her hand, a small folded paper. Later, in the privacy of her cabin, she opened it to find a message in Burke's distinctive handwriting. "Courage. Friends remain. Watch for the signal." Hope flared within her. Some of the crew must have escaped capture. She needed to be ready when opportunity presented itself. That evening with Pembroke, she employed a new strategy. She appeared more receptive to his attention, asked detailed questions about their arrival in Kingston, and expressed interest in the ship's operations. He responded predictably, flattered by her apparent change of heart. "I've been thinking about our future," she said, refilling his wineglass generously. "Perhaps I was hasty in my objections." Pembroke's expression grew smug. "I knew you'd come to your senses. Women often resist what's best for them." She swallowed her revulsion and smiled. "I'm curious about something. How did you find us?" That cove was quite hidden. Loosened by wine and pride, he revealed one of Blackwood's crew had a price. Gold speaks louder than loyalty among pirates. A traitor, she murmured. How appropriate. And the Crimson Siren, being sailed to Kingston by a prize crew. He reached for her hand. Your father's shipping company has expressed interest in acquiring her once she's been refitted. Elizabeth allowed him to hold her hand while her mind processed this information. And Captain Blackwood, may I speak with him before justice is served? Pembroke's grip tightened painfully. Absolutely not. That man has corrupted your thinking enough already. Of course, she agreed quickly. Forgive my momentary weakness. Later, alone in her cabin, Elizabeth wrote in her new journal, but this time she wrote the truth. Her plan to save Blackwood and his loyal crew, her determination to escape Pembroke's clutches, and her growing certainty that her feelings for the pirate captain went far beyond admiration or infatuation. She hid this journal carefully within her mattress, knowing it could condemn her if found. But some truths needed to be recorded, even if only for herself. 2 more days passed aboard the Intrepid, each hour bringing them closer to Kingston and Blackwood's execution. Elizabeth maintained her charade of gradual acceptance toward Pembroke, gaining small freedoms as his suspicion waned. She was now permitted to walk the deck without a constant escort, though never near the hatch leading to the hold where the prisoners were kept. During one such walk, she noticed the same cabin boy from before, scrubbing the deck nearby. As she passed, he whispered without looking up, "Midnight, 3 taps on your door." Elizabeth gave no sign of having heard, continuing her leisurely circuit of the quarterdeck. Inside, her heart raced with anticipation. Contact with Blackwood's allies was the first step toward a rescue plan. That evening, Pembroke was unusually attentive during dinner, presenting her with a small jeweled brooch. "A token of our reconciliation," he explained. Elizabeth accepted it with feigned gratitude, noting that it would make a useful item to barter if necessary. "You're too generous, my lord." "Not at all. It pleases me to see you embracing your proper future." He leaned closer. "I've been thinking we might advance our wedding plans. The governor's residence in Kingston has a lovely chapel." She nearly dropped her fork. "So soon? But surely my father would wish to be present." "He can attend our second ceremony in London," Pembroke dismissed her concern. "I see no reason to delay once we reach port." The implication was clear. He intended to secure her as his wife before she could change her mind or be influenced by outside forces. Elizabeth forced herself to smile through her rising panic. "Such haste might start unfortunate rumors," she suggested. "People might think there was necessity behind our urgency." Pembroke frowned at the implied impropriety. "Perhaps you're right. A proper engagement period would be more appropriate." She had bought herself time, but the urgency of escape intensified. After returning to her cabin, Elizabeth prepared for her midnight visitor. She loosened a metal stay from her corset to use as a potential weapon if this proved to be a trap, then waited in tense silence. 3 soft taps came precisely at midnight. She opened the door cautiously to find the cabin boy, who slipped inside with surprising agility for his small size. "Miss Hastings," he whispered, pulling off his cap to reveal a mop of red hair. "I'm Timothy, served as powder monkey on the Crimson Siren." "I remember you," she replied softly. "What news?" "Captain's alive but heavily guarded. Most of the crew's locked in the forward hold." He handed her a folded piece of paper. "Mr. Fletcher escaped capture. He sent this." Elizabeth unfolded the message, reading the cryptic text by moonlight. "Crimson follows 2 leagues back. Watch signal lanterns night of 3rd day. When you see 3 lights vertical, be ready. Create distraction if possible." "Fletcher? How did Fletcher escape?" she whispered. "Wasn't aboard when they took the ship," Timothy explained. "He'd gone to arrange supplies on the island. When he returned, he saw what happened and took a fishing boat to follow, managed to recapture the Siren from the prize crew during the first night. Elizabeth's admiration for the resourceful quartermaster grew. How many men does he have? 15 of ours who weren't aboard during capture, plus some local fishermen with grudges against the Navy. Timothy glanced nervously at the door. Not enough for a direct assault, but enough for something clever. And you? How are you moving freely? Cabin boys are practically invisible, he replied with a hint of pride. They transferred me to help the Intrepid's cook. Nobody notices when I disappear for a few minutes. Elizabeth quickly considered their assets and liabilities. Can you get messages to the captain? Timothy shook his head. He's in the aft hold under special guard. But I can reach the others. Good. Tell them to be ready. 3 nights from now. She thought for a moment, and I need something smuggled to me. Anything small that could pick a lock. Timothy grinned and produced a slender metal file from his sleeve. Mr. Burke thought you might ask for something like this. She took it gratefully. One more thing. Was there truly a traitor among the crew? His expression darkened. Simmons, one of the newer men. Captain never trusted him fully. He moved toward the door. I should go before I'm missed. Wait. Elizabeth quickly retrieved her quill and scribbled a note on the back of Fletcher's message. Get this to Fletcher if you can. It's information about guard rotations and ship protocols. After Timothy departed, Elizabeth hid the file in her mattress alongside her journal. 3 days until the rescue attempt. 3 days to perfect her role in the plan. The next morning she joined Pembroke for breakfast on deck, positioning herself to observe the daily changing of the guards at the prisoner holds. While maintaining pleasant conversation, she counted men, noted weapons, and identified the officer who carried the keys. Each detail was mentally recorded for later addition to her hidden journal. You seem in good spirits today, Pembroke observed, watching her with newfound approval. Elizabeth smiled. The picture of a proper English lady resigned to her advantageous match. I'm simply adapting to... Elizabeth spent the next day gathering what resources she could without arousing suspicion. She complained of a minor headache, allowing her to obtain a small vial of laudanum from the ship's surgeon. During afternoon she pocketed a silver butter knife. At dinner, she deliberately tore her dress on a chair, necessitating a sewing kit be brought to her cabin. Pembroke remained oblivious to her preparations, interpreting her attentiveness as growing affection. His guard lowered further, and he began sharing more details about their arrival in Kingston, planned for the morning after next. The governor is arranging a public execution, he mentioned casually over brandy. Blackwood's hanging will serve as an example to other pirates in these waters. Elizabeth maintained her composure with effort. So soon after arrival? Justice delayed is justice denied, Pembroke replied. Besides, holding such an infamous prisoner creates unnecessary risk. May I ask a personal question, my lord? She leaned forward slightly, adopting an expression of innocent curiosity. What truly happened between you and Captain Blackwood? The official record seems incomplete. Pembroke's expression darkened. He was under my command during a campaign against Spanish interests in the region. A brilliant strategist, but he developed inappropriate sympathies. Sympathies? For the locals, for slaves on the plantations. His voice hardened. He questioned orders that would have advanced British interests considerably. When I proceeded without his approval, he sabotaged the operation and deserted. Elizabeth processed this carefully. That differs somewhat from deserting during battle. The official record serves the Crown's interests, Pembroke stated coldly. The truth would have raised uncomfortable questions in Parliament. He studied her face. Why such interest in a condemned man? Know thy enemy, she quoted smoothly. Understanding his betrayal helps me recognize how thoroughly I was deceived during my captivity. Seemingly satisfied, Pembroke escorted her back to her cabin with a lingering kiss on her hand that made her skin crawl. Once alone, Elizabeth added this new information to her hidden journal. pieces of Blackwood's past falling into place. The final day dawned bright and clear. Kingston lay less than 24 hours away. Elizabeth moved through her morning routine with deliberate calm, though anxiety churned beneath her composed exterior. Tonight would determine all their fates. She'd received one final message from Timothy, third watch. Be prepared for rough seas. While Pembroke attended to naval duties, Elizabeth finalized her preparations. She plaited her hair tightly, securing the small metal file within the braid as a last resort. The butter knife and sewing scissors were hidden in her petticoats. Most crucially, she had diluted the laudanum in a small flask of brandy, Pembroke's preferred nightcap. That evening she joined him for what would be their final dinner aboard the Intrepid. He was in high spirits, discussing their future with confident presumption. "I've secured a residence in Kingston with an excellent view of the harbour," he informed her. "We'll stay there while arrangements are made for our return to England." "How thoughtful," she replied, refilling his wineglass generously. "Though I confess some anxiety about tomorrow's spectacle." "The execution?" he waved dismissively. "You needn't attend. I was thinking more of seeing the prisoners brought ashore," she clarified. "After my experience, it may prove distressing." Pembroke's expression softened with patronizing concern. "Of course, you shall remain at the residence until the unpleasantness concludes." As the meal ended, Elizabeth produced her flask, a small toast to new beginnings. His eyebrows rose in surprise at her forwardness, but he nodded approval. She poured the drugged brandy into his glass, then a small amount of untainted brandy for herself. "To our future," he declared, drinking deeply. "To justice," she responded with perfect ambiguity. They retired to the deck for a turn in the evening air. The sky was cloudless, stars emerging as twilight deepened. Elizabeth scanned the horizon surreptitiously, seeking any sign of the Crimson Siren. The vastness of the dark ocean revealed nothing. Pembroke began detailing plans for their wedding, his words gradually slowing as the laudanum took effect. He blinked heavily, attributing his sudden drowsiness to the day's exertions and the wine at dinner. "Perhaps you should rest, my lord," Elizabeth suggested. "Tomorrow brings significant events." He agreed with unusual docility, allowing her to escort him to his quarters. At his door he attempted to kiss her, but she deftly redirected it to her cheek. "Until tomorrow," she murmured, watching as he stumbled inside. Returning to her cabin, Elizabeth changed into the simplest dress she possessed, securing her hair with a plain ribbon that concealed the small dagger she'd extracted from her hairbrush handle. The waiting proved most difficult, hours of tense anticipation, while the ship gradually quieted for the night. Just before the third watch, she positioned herself near her window, eyes straining through the darkness. The moment finally came, 3 vertical lights appearing briefly on the horizon, so faint they might have been mistaken for stars. Elizabeth took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. It was time. She removed the small dagger from her hair, its blade catching the moonlight. Whatever happened next, she would not return to England as Pembroke's wife, nor would she allow Blackwood to meet the gallows without a fight. Elizabeth slipped from her cabin into the darkened corridor. The Intrepid slumbered around her, skeletal night watch manning essential positions. She moved with deliberate care, staying close to the shadows, her footsteps barely audible against the creaking of the ship's timbers. The officers' quarters lay behind her, the prisoner hold her destination. 2 Marines stood guard at the hatchway, alert despite the late hour. Elizabeth pressed herself against a bulkhead, mind racing. She needed a distraction. As if in answer to her thoughts, a commotion erupted on the main deck. Shouts of alarm, running footsteps, orders barked with urgent authority. The guards exchanged glances, clearly torn between maintaining their post and investigating the disturbance. A midshipman appeared, breathless with excitement. "Fire in the forward hold. All hands needed." One guard hesitated. "We can't leave the prisoners." "Captain's orders," the midshipman insisted. The armory could be threatened. That decided them. Both Marines hurried away, following the panicked sailor. Elizabeth waited until their footsteps faded before emerging from her hiding place. The abandoned hatchway stood unguarded, almost too convenient. She approached cautiously, suspecting a trap. Finding none, she descended into the gloom of the hold. Lanterns cast meager light over the cramped space where Blackwood was allegedly kept in isolation. She moved forward, straining to see in the darkness. "Captain?" she whispered, peering into the shadows. A shape detached itself from the gloom. Not Blackwood, but Timothy. "Miss Hastings, this way quickly." The distraction on deck. "Fletcher's men," he confirmed, leading her deeper into the hold. "They created the diversion while I slipped aboard to find you." They reached a heavily secured door. Timothy produced a ring of keys with a grin. Lifted from the Marine captain during the confusion, the lock yielded with a satisfying click. Elizabeth pushed the door open to find Blackwood inside, wrists shackled to the wall. Despite days of confinement, he maintained his commanding presence. His eyes widened at the sight of her. "Elizabeth," he breathed, disbelief and hope warring in his expression. "What are you doing?" "Apparently rescuing you," she replied, gesturing for Timothy to unlock the shackles. "Though I suspect there's more to Fletcher's plan than I've been told." As if summoned by her words, a tremendous boom shook the ship. Cannon fire, but not directed at the Intrepid. Through the small porthole, Elizabeth glimpsed the night sky illuminated by burning sails on a nearby vessel. That would be the Crimson Siren engaging the escort ships, Blackwood deduced, as Timothy freed him, creating confusion while keeping the Intrepid itself unharmed. "We need to free the others," Elizabeth urged. Blackwood rubbed his chafed wrists. "First we need weapons." Timothy produced a pistol and cutlass. Courtesy of Mr. Fletcher, they moved swiftly through the hold toward the forward section, where the crew was imprisoned. Above them, chaos reigned as the Intrepid's men responded to the attack on their escort vessels. Elizabeth felt the ship heel as it maneuvered to assist its companions. "This works to our advantage," Blackwood observed. "They're focusing outward, not on potential threats within." They reached the main hold where Riley, Burke and 24 crewmen were confined. Timothy made quick work of the locks, while Blackwood explained the situation in terse sentences. The men armed themselves with whatever improvised weapons they could find among the cargo. "We need to reach the deck and signal Fletcher," Blackwood directed. "Elizabeth, you should remain here where it's safer." She fixed him with a determined stare. "I didn't come this far to hide in the hold." Something flashed in his eyes, pride perhaps, or admiration. "Stay close then." As they prepared to ascend, the hatch flew open. Framed in the opening stood Pembroke, his uniform disheveled, fury etched in every line of his face. Behind him, armed Marines poured into position. "I should have known," he snarled, gaze locked on Elizabeth. "Whore to pirates and traitors." Blackwood stepped forward protectively. "Your quarrel is with me, Pembroke. She's an innocent party." "Is she?" Pembroke's laugh held no humor. "She drugged my brandy, hardly the action of an innocent." His cold eyes narrowed. "Take them all. Shoot any who resist." The pirates tensed for battle, though outnumbered and underarmed. Elizabeth felt rather than saw Blackwood's subtle signal to his men, a gesture to wait, to hold for the right moment. That moment came in the form of another explosion, this one much closer. The Intrepid herself shuddered violently, throwing several Marines off balance. Through the open hatch came shouts of "boarders." Starboard side, Fletcher had brought the Crimson Siren alongside during the confusion. Chaos erupted in the hold. Blackwood's crew surged forward, engaging the Marines in close-quarters combat. Elizabeth found herself back-to-back with Burke, the elderly doctor wielding a belaying pin with surprising effectiveness. "Stay close to me, lass," he instructed, deflecting a bayonet thrust. Blackwood cut a path toward the hatch, his movement fluid despite days of confinement. Elizabeth followed, ducking under a swinging musket. They emerged onto the main deck to find a full-scale battle underway, the Crimson Siren's crew having boarded from multiple points. Across the deck, she spotted Fletcher directing the assault, his distinctive silhouette unmistakable in the moonlight. Blackwood whistled sharply, catching his quartermaster's attention. Fletcher's face split in a wide grin before he returned to the fight with renewed vigor. The jolly boat, Blackwood pointed to the stern, where a small craft hung ready to be lowered. "We need to get our men there." They fought their way across the deck, gathering crewmen as they went. Elizabeth used her small dagger effectively, disabling rather than killing when possible. The chaos worked in their favor. The Intrepid's crew divided between defending against boarders and battling fires, started by flaming arrows. They had nearly reached the stern when Pembroke appeared before them, sword drawn, 2 Marines at his side. "You won't escape, Blackwood," he declared. "Not this time. Stand aside, Commodore," Blackwood replied evenly. "You've lost this night." "Have I?" Pembroke's smile was cold. "Your precious crew is outnumbered. Your ship will be sunk. And you," his gaze shifted to Elizabeth, "you've lost something far more valuable than freedom." With terrifying swiftness, he lunged, not at Blackwood, but at Elizabeth. She barely evaded the blade, feeling it slice through her sleeve. Blackwood moved instantly, engaging Pembroke while shouting for her to run. Elizabeth backed away but refused to flee. Instead, she circled behind a cannon, watching for an opportunity to assist. The 2 men fought with the familiarity of former comrades, each anticipating the other's moves, matching skill with skill. "You always were too principled for your own good," Pembroke taunted between strikes. "The Crown needed men willing to do what was necessary." "Necessary," Blackwood parried a vicious thrust. "Massacring islanders to secure trading rights. Burning villages to demonstrate British power. You confused necessity with barbarism." Their swords clashed again, the sound ringing across the deck. Despite his days in chains, Blackwood matched Pembroke's strength, but Elizabeth could see fatigue beginning to affect him. When Pembroke landed a shallow cut across his ribs, she knew she had to act. Retrieving a fallen pistol, she aimed carefully, waiting for a clear shot. When it came, she fired without hesitation. The ball struck Pembroke's sword arm, causing him to drop his weapon with a howl of pain and rage. Blackwood seized the advantage, disarming Pembroke completely and forcing him to his knees. Around them, the battle was turning, more of the Intrepid's crew surrendering as the Crimson Siren's men gained control of key positions. "Finish it," Pembroke hissed, clutching his wounded arm. "Prove you're the pirate they claim." Blackwood studied him for a long moment. Death would be too simple. Instead of striking, he removed a signet ring from his own finger and pressed it into Elizabeth's hand. "Hold this for me." To Pembroke he said, "You'll stand trial for your actual crimes, the massacre at Martinique, the burning of Santo Domingo. I've kept detailed records, including your orders and correspondence." Pembroke's face drained of color. "You wouldn't dare. It would implicate the Crown." "The Crown disavowed those actions when challenged," Blackwood countered. "You acted without authorization, as my testimony will prove." Before Pembroke could respond, Riley appeared with news that the Intrepid was secured and the escort vessels disabled or fled. "Time to go, Captain. Navy reinforcements won't be far behind." Blackwood nodded. "Transfer the prisoners to the hold. Leave enough supplies for a week's journey." To Pembroke he added, "Consider yourself fortunate. I'm showing more mercy than you would have." As they prepared to depart, Elizabeth stood at the rail, Blackwood's ring warm in her palm. He joined her, something unspoken passing between them. "You risked everything," he said quietly. "As did you once," she replied, "for principles you believed in." Understanding dawned in his eyes. She knew the truth of his past now, the real reason for his desertion, and turned to piracy. Not cowardice or betrayal, but refusal to participate in atrocities. Fletcher called from the Crimson Siren that all was ready. As they crossed to their ship, Elizabeth felt the weight of Blackwood's ring in her hand, not just a piece of metal, but a promise. A future neither of them had dared imagine might now be possible. The Crimson Siren pulled away from the disabled Intrepid, sails filling with the night wind. On deck, the reunited crew celebrated their improbable victory. Elizabeth stood beside Blackwood at the helm, watching Kingston's distant lights fade behind them as they turned toward the open sea and whatever freedom awaited. 1 month later, the Crimson Siren anchored in a secluded cove off the coast of Barbados. The crew had celebrated their victory over Pembroke with appropriate enthusiasm, but now faced the sobering reality of increased naval patrols hunting for the infamous pirate ship. They needed a new strategy, perhaps even a new identity. Elizabeth stood on the quarterdeck beside Blackwood, watching the sunset paint the western sky in hues of gold and crimson. The past weeks had transformed them both. Her father's ships now actively avoided engagement with the Crimson Siren. Whether from fear or reluctant acceptance of his daughter's choices, she couldn't be certain. Blackwood, for his part, had grown more open about his past, sharing with her the full story of his naval career and the moral stand that had cost him everything. "What will you do now?" she asked, breaking their companionable silence. "The Caribbean grows more dangerous for pirates with each passing month." "Indeed it does," he agreed, his hand covering hers where it rested on the rail. The familiar warmth of his touch still sent a pleasant shiver through her. "Perhaps it's time for the ghost of Gibraltar to disappear for good, and Captain Blackwood with him." His mouth curved in a smile. Captain Blackwood might transform into a merchant captain of slightly unconventional methods. "There are legitimate opportunities for a man with my knowledge of these waters." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Reformed pirate turns honest trader. That would make quite the story." "Not entirely honest, perhaps," he admitted with a wink, "but selective in our targets. Spanish treasure ships still seem fair game, while merchant vessels might find themselves unexpectedly escorted through dangerous waters for a reasonable fee." She laughed, enjoying his vision of a future that balanced adventure with greater security. "And what role do you imagine for me in this enterprise?" Blackwood turned to face her fully, his expression growing serious. "Whatever role you desire, navigator, partner," he hesitated, then added softly, "wife." The word hung between them, weighted with possibility. Elizabeth touched the signet ring she now wore on a chain around her neck. "I once wrote of dreams that seemed impossible," she reminded him, "of children with your strategic mind and my determination." "I remember," he replied, his voice deepening. Every word. From his pocket he produced a small leather-bound journal, new, its pages blank except for the first, where 2 names had been inscribed, James and Elizabeth Blackwood. "A new chapter," he explained. "One we might write together, if you're willing." Elizabeth accepted the journal, recognizing the profound gesture behind it. "I am more than willing." Their kiss was interrupted by cheers from the crew, who had been watching with poorly disguised interest. Riley approached with a bottle of fine rum, Burke following with cups for a toast. "To the captain and his lady," Riley proposed, genuine affection evident beneath his gruff exterior. "To new horizons," Burke added with a knowing smile. As celebration spread across the deck, Elizabeth found herself contemplating the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. From reluctant captive to willing accomplice, from proper merchant's daughter to a woman who had found freedom on the open sea. Later that night, she made the first entry in their shared journal. "Today marks the beginning of our greatest adventure. The Crimson Siren sails at dawn for new waters, with a new purpose. James speaks of legitimate trading, though I suspect the pirate in him will never fully disappear. As for me, I have found a home I never expected, and a love I once only dared dream about. What fortune awaits us remains uncertain, but of one thing I am sure: whatever storms we face, we will weather them together." On the horizon, dawn approached, promising new possibilities.